The first stage of the Civil War began around a rail junction about 35 miles to the west of Washington called Manassas Junction, which laid aside a small creek called Bull Run. We'll then see, after the first Manassas, McClellan's army, then the war in the west, and then the emergence of Moss Robert, as they call it. The Civil War was one of the most photographed wars and one of the first photographed wars. Matthew Brady, among them, who was a protege of Samuel Morse, had developed glass plate negatives which made photography much more common, and here you see one of the photographs of the Manassas battlefield after the first Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of First Manassas at Manassas Junction, west of Washington, involved the Union commander Irvin McDowell, who had been brought in from the West Coast to take command of the army, and he had very little time to train or review his army in any way. The Confederate commander was none other than P.G.T. Beauregard. This is also called the Battle of First Bull Run on April the 4th, 1861. It was a catastrophe for the Union, who went out on a bright, sunny April day with people actually loading up their wagons with their family to go have a picnic lunch and watch the battle. What is notable about this battle is that this is where Thomas J. Jackson, the Confederate general, gets his name Stonewall, because he was holding the left side of the Confederate flank like a stone wall, as Beauregard called it. The Union Army at first advanced and then suddenly broke in retreat, and the road back to Washington was in absolute disarray, as the people who had been picnicking were also flying back to Washington in a panic. In the aftermath of the battle, McDowell was relieved, and he was relieved to be relieved. He was sent back out to the West Coast. Lincoln then fired Simon Cameron and made Stanton Secretary of War, and then he made 34-year-old George Brinton McClellan commander of what came to be known as the Army of the Potomac. This map shows Washington and then Richmond, the two capitals, just 100 miles from each other, and the location of Manassas Junction, just to the west of Washington. This is another map showing the strategic location of Manassas on the railroad that led down to Richmond. This was the On to Richmond campaign that never really got further than Manassas. In this slide, you see two of the great characters of the Civil War. On the left is Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was absolutely heroic in battle to almost to a fault, On the right is Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War from Ohio, and their beards give illumination as to the character of both of these men. Very wild, very woolly. Lincoln had named George Brinton McClellan as the commander of the Army of the Potomac because he had won a series of small battles along the Ohio frontier. He was called the Little Napoleon, and you see him there, affecting the Napoleonic pose. He had a great deal of confidence in himself when it came to organizing and training his army. He trained the living heck out of his army. But he was very reluctant to fight with the army. And furthermore, he was not a Republican, he was a Union Democrat, which meant that he was in an opposite political party from the president, and he felt that there were men in the cabinet that were out to get him, including Secretary of War Stanton, who was also a Union Democrat. McClellan's biggest problem is that he needed to have all of his ducks in a row before he was comfortable to move forward, which led to great periods of inactivity in his army as far as combat went, to the point where Lincoln in Washington telegraphed him once and said, "General McClellan, if you're not willing to fight with your army, lend it to me for a while and I'll go fight with it." That is the picture of Julia Ward Howe, who came up with the anthem of the Civil War for the North, called the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The Civil War was fought along a 1,000-mile front from the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, and eastern Virginia, all the way into Texas, and even into the southwestern territories that had been taken during the Mexican War. In the West, the Union possessed the better officers and won numerous victories over the Confederates. The war in the West is often overlooked because of the events in Virginia. And both sides tended to recruit Indians. And you remember our 5 civilized tribes that had been subject to the Indian Removal Act in the 1830s? They sided with the Confederacy, but they did not really fight with the Confederacy. They just sided with it. The war was won in the West long before Appomattox at places like Shiloh, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, New Orleans, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and so forth. One of the first big keys identified in the war was the city of New Orleans, which of course guarded the entrance to the interior of the country through the Mississippi River. The task of taking New Orleans was undertaken by David Glasgow Farragut, a vice admiral in the U.S. Navy, and his stepbrother, David Dixon Porter, a Commodore. Farragut had been a cabin boy during the War of 1812. He was now 60 years old by the time of the Civil War and was known for his bravery and courage. In fact, when they were going into Mobile Bay to take Mobile, one of their lookouts said, "Sir, there are torpedoes ahead." Torpedoes were mines. They were not the moving torpedoes that we know today. And Farragut issued his famous phrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Well, you reached the mouth of the river. The South's most important port was New Orleans, and it was guarded by Forts Jackson and St. Philip, about 100 miles south, or 60 miles south of the city. The forts had been guarded by a river chain across the river that were also had fire ships attached to them. In their usual way, Farragut and Porter cut the river chain and ran the fire of the two forts, and New Orleans surrendered rather than fight it out. Unlike Atlanta or Memphis or Richmond, which fought to the bitter end, New Orleans was spared from being burned to the ground. It's one of the reasons why there is a French Quarter in New Orleans today. Farragut went ashore, raised the American flag above the U.S. Mint, which was the chief governmental building in New Orleans, federal governmental building, and then realized that his land forces had not made it up the river, so he retreated back to the safety of his ships, and William B. Mumford, a gambler and an ardent Confederate sympathizer, climbed up onto the roof of the Mint and cut down the American flag to a cheering crowd. Eventually, though, the American forces would enter the city under the command of Benjamin Franklin Butler, one of those political generals from Massachusetts, and had a very harsh, draconian reign in New Orleans. He did two things. One, he issued General Order Number 28, which was designed to keep women of the town from insulting or throwing things like their chamber pots onto soldiers. And General Order 28 said that any woman who insulted or interfered with a soldier would be treated as a prostitute. This, of course, was an assault on the honor of all Southern women, and even Jefferson Davis protested and offered a $10,000 reward for Benjamin Butler. Butler was then replaced by Nathaniel P. Banks. Now, Banks was a far better commander-occupier of New Orleans, although he was not a very good general in the field. But both Butler and Banks had managed to utilize their soldiers to clean the city of New Orleans. And Banks, being an engineer, actually laid down the foundations for a sewage and water system in New Orleans. It's ironic that although the city was under occupation by Union forces and everybody hated it, there was not a single yellow fever outbreak while the Union occupied New Orleans, and that's because they kept the city so clean. Well, there are no streets named after Butler in New Orleans anymore, but there is a street named after Nathaniel P. Banks. On the map here you see where Forts Jackson and St. Philip are located and where the city of New Orleans is located. On the left is Admiral Farragut, who gets quite a bit of notoriety in real life, and he's also fictionalized. He's placed in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at the beginning and at the end of the book. On the right is his stepbrother, David Dixon Porter. This is an artist's depiction of the federal boats running the fire of the Forts Jackson and St. Philip. On the left is Benjamin Franklin Butler, Spoons Butler as he was called, because whenever he went into the homes of wealthy New Orleanians, it seemed that the silverware was always missing, and because of General Order Number 28, he was nicknamed the Beast as well. On the right is Nathaniel P. Banks. Like I said, he was not a very good general in the field. He led his men into western Louisiana and fought at the Battle of Mansfield. And there he was defeated and had to retreat, but he burned western Louisiana almost to a cinder. And that has both pros and cons to it. The pros will later become evident during World War II, as Louisiana, being so desolate, was ideal for use in tank maneuvering during the Second World War. And you can thank General Banks for that. And here you can read the text of General Order Number 28. At the outset of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee's hair was jet black. He then took over command of the Virginia militia and almost overnight went to gray. Some people speculate that it's because of his heart disease from which he was suffering throughout the Civil War. He was known as Morris Robert, and he was Jefferson Davis's chief military advisor in Richmond. But Lee wanted a command in the field, and eventually he would get it when Joseph Johnston would be wounded. McClellan did something that was significantly or symbolically rather foolish. He made his headquarters in General Cornwallis's headquarters at Yorktown. You don't want to make your headquarters in the defeated general's headquarters from the Revolutionary War. During the campaign, Robert E. Lee takes over the Confederate Army. He replaced Joseph Johnston because Johnston had been wounded seriously in the battle, and Davis did not like Johnston. Finally, at last, Davis gives Lee the go-ahead to take over the army. Robert E. Lee graduated first at West Point. Academically, he graduated second, but he did not receive a single demerit. Despite his very proper demeanor, he was well liked by most of his men at West Point. And he was an unwilling Confederate. He was actually offered command of the Union Army prior to the Civil War, but when Virginia chose to leave the Union, Lee, being from one of the first families of Virginia, could not leave his state and fight against it. It shows you the great attachment that people had to their states, which predated the Union. Lee was the type of general who never could be outthought by anybody. He was a tremendous strategist, a tremendous tactician, and he was a risk taker. And sometimes the risks did not pay off, but most of the time he took the risk because he knew he had to, because he was outnumbered, because the armies could not last much longer in the situations they were in. When he takes over, the campaign that Lee took on against McClellan was called the 7 Days Battle because it was a series of bold strokes against the Union forces over 7 days. Each one of the battles, Gaines Mill, Mechanicsville, Garnett's and Golding's Farm, Savage Station, and Glendale, and finally Malvern Hill, these were all tactical wins by the Union. And yet McClellan was so unnerved that he withdrew down the James Peninsula and ended the campaign, knowing full well that he had failed in his great plan, and would then withdraw and be cashiered as general. Nicknamed Morris Robert by African Americans, Granny Lee by his fellow soldiers, and Bobby Lee, by the Union, Robert E. Lee, will take over the Confederate Army during what is known as the Peninsular Campaign. This was George McClellan's great wheeling movement to bring the Union Army down to the peninsula between the James and the York Rivers, the same exact place where the settlement of Virginia began. Here you see the Peninsular Campaign, and which even got within sight of the church steeples of Richmond at one point. Lee had lost 20,000 men in the 7 days battle, McClellan 16, but remember that the Confederates could ill afford to lose that many men. And so Lee takes his first great risk. Meanwhile, McClellan is relieved of command. He's replaced by General John Pope, a very braggadocious and alienating general to most of his staff, proudly proclaiming how great he had done out on the western frontier and that he expected them to stop failing on the eastern frontier. Well, then he goes out into the field proclaiming that his headquarters were in the saddle, and all the soldiers were saying his headquarters is where his hindquarters should be. And Lee handed him his ass on a stick. And this is when Lee takes his great risk. He continues north into Maryland. The morale of the Union troops is very, very low. And then McClellan is reinstated as commander. And this brings the morale of the Union troops up high because they absolutely loved McClellan. And so the two armies then march north into Maryland.